comedy are two of the most popular film genres out there. They speak to some of our deepest emotions, fear, and happiness. The need to laugh and the need to scream. There's a release with both of these for filmgoers, and it's the reason that we go to the movies. There's nothing like a good horror film to make you feel alive. And there's nothing like a good comedy to show you how ridiculous the world is. When you combine horror and comedy in a film, it's a rare hat trick when it works perfectly. In the summer of 1984, that hat trick happened massively for kids and adults with a movie that would go down in pop culture history, a little film called Ghostbusters. Not only that, but it would become a true family affair right from the start and through to today. Seeing Ghostbusters for the first time was something that I hadn't experienced before. Major comedy stars came together with impressive special effects and created a hybrid horror comedy sci-fi film that became a blockbuster. It became a pop culture phenomenon, and honestly, it's only got more prominent over the decades. On today's 80s horror memories, we're strapping on our proton packs and heading back to 1984, and you know who we're gonna call
Ghostbusters!
For me personally, as an actor, I got inspired in my early years by comedies, sitcoms, variety shows, anything that made me laugh. Jerry Lewis movies, Danny Kaye movies. But so when looking at a fantastical, scary movie with supernatural elements in it, like Ghostbusters, if you infuse laughs in that, you have me hooked.
I love Ghostbusters. Who doesn't love Ghostbusters? It's hilarious. It's also kind of scary.
The story behind Ghostbusters began far earlier than 1984 and would start with writer and star Dan Aykroyd's great-grandfather, Samuel. He was a dentist who used hypnosis in his treatment of patients. This led him to examine whether hypnosis could be used to speak with the dead. In the early 1900s, he began conducting seances and would do so up until he died in 1933. These seances would have that familiar slime element, ectoplasm, sometimes be produced. Throughout his own paranormal career, Sam Aykroyd held around 80 seances with varied results that included visitations from spirits spanning from many different times, including ancient Egypt and China. When Sam passed away, his son Maurice, Dan's grandfather, and Dan's father Peter would continue to attempt communication with the spirit world. Much like Egon and Ray, not so much Venkman, Maurice and Dan would work creating an apparatus that would allow them to contact the spirits. They sadly never succeeded in this, but based on the number of movies where people did achieve that and how those turned out, it was probably for the best. Peter kept going through with his interest and investigating the paranormal. He built a pretty extensive library based around his grandfather's work and books on the subject, which would feed a young Dan's love of the paranormal and an obsession shared by others in his family, like that of his grandfather, whose journals were an inspiration for a little script he was working on back in the early 80s. Aykroyd's background with spiritualism had already given him part of the core of Ghostbusters, but it was while reading a quantum physics and theoretical physics book that set the science side of that film in place. What if you could trap a ghost? How would that even work? The idea blew up like an overfull containment unit. Dan Aykroyd began writing the script with specific actors in mind for the roles. This would consist of hot young comics of the day, who had co-starred with him on SNL and other feature films. John Belushi would play the role of Venkman, and Eddie Murphy would be Winston. In this version of the film, Belushi's role would be slightly different than what it would eventually become, and Winston would have a much more significant role to play. He would also have a background in the military. For those who weren't born or aware back then, I can't stress enough how big of a deal the cast of SNL and comics like Eddie Murphy and John Belushi were. Eddie Murphy was one of the decade's biggest and most controversial comics. He was a stand-up comic rock star and had a massive HBO special under his belt with Delirious. And in 1987, a motion picture stand-up concert was released called Eddie Murphy Raw that would rake in $50 million. He was huge. And when Aykroyd was writing the film and planning to cast him, he came off 2 hits with 48 Hours and Trading Places. John Belushi was one of Aykroyd's fellow original not ready for primetime players on SNL from the beginning. He was a wild man when it came to performing and in life. Some of the most iconic characters to come out of the original run of SNL were thanks to Belushi. Most notable would be Jake and Elwood, the Blues Brothers, which he'd do with Aykroyd and would give Belushi an excellent opportunity to show his dancing skills as well as his singing. Fans had already seen Belushi show that he could stretch from the small screen to the big one, with massive hits like Animal House and the feature film version of the Blues Brothers. The thought of these 3 joining forces to make a massive intergalactic ghost fighting epic was mind-blowing. The kicker was that Aykroyd's idea wasn't even supposed to be comedic, and was way more serious and played more like a horror and sci-fi film, but it would turn out that this just wasn't meant to be the path that Ghostbusters would travel, and it would change course with a massive loss to Aykroyd and the rest of the world. Dan Aykroyd said that he was writing the script and had just finished a line for John Belushi when he got the call in March of 1982 that Belushi was dead at 33. With the loss of John Belushi, Aykroyd went to another SNL vet and friend in Bill Murray, yet another massive comedy star. But with Murray's ad, it would appear that Eddie Murphy wasn't to be part of the team. Murphy picked Beverly Hills Cop to film instead, which would give him a starring role and a major franchise as Axel Foley. You can't blame him for this though, as Beverly Hills Cop would join Ghostbusters in 1984 as one of the top 10 box office earners of the year. Aykroyd would meet with Ivan Reitman to talk about the film, and Reitman would soon squash the original concepts, thinking that it should be way more of a comedy. He also felt that Aykroyd's scope was way too enormous for a studio to agree on, budget-wise. Reitman had experience with comedy and had produced Animal House and Stripes. He also produced interesting horror movies like Shivers, Rabid, and the animated genre hybrid Heavy Metal. Reitman brought in Harold Ramis, who he had worked with before and who knew his way around a script. This led to Ramis also being cast as a Ghostbuster himself. The film would switch gears in a major way, no longer having the futuristic motif that Aykroyd had initially started with, and instead being set in modern times, and following 3 scientists who start up a business due to a shared interest in the paranormal. It was during this time that the filmmakers were looking for someone to take the place of Eddie Murphy. After several black actors were scouted, the filmmakers auditioned Ernie Hudson for the role. It was a major lead then, but a sore spot would happen once filming began. Hudson states that when he got his version of the script after accepting that Winston's role had entirely changed. He'd show up about halfway through the movie, and he no longer had a military background. Winston Zeddemore wouldn't even be shown on the poster, with only Stantz, Venkman, and Spangler represented. The slight would later be rectified in a major way years later, with Winston appearing to be the most successful one ever with a major financial empire and being the one to bring them back to life in Ghostbusters Afterlife. He'd also be the boss in the new video game, Ghostbusters Spirits Unleashed. Annie Potts would be cast as the Egon-loving and bored-voiced receptionist Janine. Sigourney Weaver would be the way too good for Venkman, Dana, who lives in the possessed apartment. Weaver apparently auditioned by impersonating one of the dog monsters from the film for Reitman, snarls and all, and it got her the part. Rick Moranis would play Louis Tully, her neighbor who can't seem to win until he's turned into a hellhound, a role initially going to go to John Candy. Perhaps the real villain, even more so than Gozer, was the unfortunately named Walter Peck, played by the man that everyone seemed to love to hate during the 80s, William Atherton. Fun fact, he won't sign autographs if you ask him to put the caption, "Yes, I have no dick." Trust me on this one. The film got a budget of around $25 million, and Reitman would also direct it. The script, after being retooled by Aykroyd, gave a glimpse to the team before they donned their jumpsuits. The characters were endearing and sarcastic, at least in Venkman's case, and showed that science and smarts could be cool. They weren't perfect heroes, and that's what made them so endearing. The movie was filmed fast, with it being turned around in just 12 months. But something happened that nearly caused it not to hit its summer release date in that magic year of 1984. Back in the 1970s, there was a TV series called The Ghostbusters, a live-action comedy about paranormal detectives who work with a gorilla, played by the legendary Bob Burns. It also starred Forrest Tucker and Larry Stork. The film made a deal with Universal Studios, who owned the original series, allowing it to proceed. Unfortunately, when the spin-off cartoon happened, the two entities crossed streams again. The Ghostbusters, with the gorilla, released a cartoon series as a way to capitalize on the success, and that's why the cartoon based on the movie is called the real Ghostbusters, so there's no confusion. Although I'd think that the gorilla would keep that from happening. But the legal troubles of the Ghostbusters movie would not stop there. The hit Who You Gonna Call by Ray Parker Jr. ran afoul of Huey Lewis and the News thanks to its similar sound to I Want a New Drug. It's interesting to note that the offer to make the song for the movie had been offered to Huey Lewis, but they passed due to having already agreed to do the music for Back to the Future. The case was eventually settled out of court, but much like Vanilla Ice and his penchant for Queen, it's hard not to notice that catchy hook sounds so familiar. Those issues aside, Ghostbusters became the #1 film of 1984 and would gross nearly $300 million. The film used mind-blowing special effects, and within the guise of Slimer, or the ugly little Spud, we'd see a little bit of a love letter to John Belushi, who was used as a blueprint for the hungry and naughty ghost. Special effects legend Steve Johnson would design Slimer and would work with the head of effects on the film, Richard Edlund. Some ghosts and spirits would be drawn via sketches by other fantastic fellow artists, including the late Bernie Wrightson.
Terrific effects by Boss Films, led by Steve Johnson, who was at Boss Films at the time. And it's the effects that take that movie to a new level. And they are effects that hold up to this day.
Well, I knew I wanted to be in this world. Since I was 12. You know, I would read Starlog magazine, and you know I grew up in Texas in a very rural area, so there were a couple of places, little quickie marts that sold Starlog, and the Warren magazines, Eerie, Creepy, Vampirella, that kind of stuff. So I cut my teeth on this stuff, and I knew from the time I knew how to read and write, basically, that I wanted to make monsters.
Kids and adults alike loved Ghostbusters. The film not only celebrated science nerds, but made them the heroes. The everyday Joes of the paranormal were going to go ahead and save the day. There's a sweetness to it. And that's not the marshmallow.
But we cannot forget, really, the Godzilla of that film, the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. Come on!
When you see the guys decide, well, if we're going to go out, I'll see you on the other side, Ray. The car was neat, the proton packs were excellent, and it made a young kid who loved ghosts think that maybe they could hunt for them too. While the film dominated 1984, we wouldn't see toys until a couple of years later when the real Ghostbusters cartoon started. But man, those toys rocked. I had a few of them, and yes, I still have them. Don't judge me. And almost every 80s kid will remember that sweet taste of high-C ecto-cooler that came along with it. I wasn't one of the lucky ones who got to see this one in theaters, though. I experienced Ghostbusters on VHS, as would a number of kids. I remember thinking how I'd never seen anything like it before. I loved how the Ghostbusters were science, paranormal, and mythology nerds, just like I was. I started young. They weren't the regular heroes. They were snarky, goofy, smart, and fun. I particularly loved Egon. There was just something that Harold Ramis brought to that character that really stuck with me. Sort of like Mr. Spock, another favorite of mine. Egon would be unemotional most of the time, but you'd see these little moments where there'd be a twinkle in his eye. It was sweet. Where Venkman was sarcasm and Ray was all excitement, Egon was the stoic intellectual with the heart of gold. Egon ruled, and I have no problem saying that he was my favorite. When it came time for another cartoon series, it would be Egon who would show up from the original crew to lead the new recruits in Extreme Ghostbusters. So I guess I wasn't the only one that was partial to him.
If we can laugh about it along the way, I can keep clearing my head to get on to the next step. And the Ghostbusters, all four of them kept us going with that along the way. Solutions, weapons, laughter. Good combination.
Ghostbusters would keep growing in popularity over the years, along with a sequel and cartoon. It would also span comic books and video games. And it wouldn't surprise anyone if they found out that the number of paranormal ghost hunters you see all over TV these days didn't grow up watching it, and therefore get the bug for busting. Over the years, much like Star Wars fans, teams like the Real Ohio Ghostbusters have been created by fans. These groups will do charity events and raise money for causes while showing off their gear and iconic jumpsuits. And sometimes that gear is so good that the films actually ask them to create props for the latest movie. This was indeed a family affair from the start. Beyond the inspiration from Dan Aykroyd's family history of investigating the paranormal was Ivan Reitman and his son Jason, who would take over the reins of writing and directing with 2021's Ghostbusters Afterlife. The film would beautifully illustrate the importance of and longevity of family and friendship, and be a fantastic tribute to the late great Harold Ramis, who helped shape the universe into the one that we love. I bawled my eyes out, okay? That's what I'm saying. Ivan and Jason would be on set for the film together, working, as Ivan would also produce the project. Sadly, though, Ivan Reitman passed away only a few months after the film's release. It would also be revealed that Reitman would actually do some of the motion capture for the Ghost of Egon. The Ghostbusters keep on busting, and there's a new film on the way that's continuing the legacy that started way back in 1984. 1984 was a magic year for movies and monster kids, but it gave us a new way to look at the things that spook us. We could laugh at them, scream, or look them in the eye, and if we were fortunate, we just might get slimed. Ghostbusters was a whole new mythology and world for fans like me. We'd all want a protein pack of our own and a pet Slimer to feed hot dogs too. I wanted to slide down a fire pole and slam on the siren of the Ecto-1. Heck, who doesn't own a shirt with the logo on it? It was a perfect mesh of gadgets, scares, comedy, and a world where anyone could become a Ghostbuster. I mean, if you could tell the guys on screen were living a little bit of a childhood dream come true, think about all of us 80s kids watching it happen for the first time.
On the next episode, 1, 2, JoBlo Horror is coming for you. Whatever you do, don't fall asleep. Until next time, Gore Hounds.
This isn't bad. There's so many different variations of it. Because, you know, the original Slimer, just a big floppy piece of foam rubber with rods and sticks, and it just wobbled, and we put spring steel bands in it. So it was constantly deforming and changing what it looked like, far beyond what you could do with regular animatronics. I didn't use cable control like I'd learned from Rick Baker and Rob Bottin. I just put sticks on it and just wobbled that thing around. And I put hands in it, like people would be in black suits behind it, muscling the cheeks. There was a tongue glove that came out of its mouth. It was just somebody wearing a tongue glove. We just, because we wanted it to be like a Tex Avery cartoon. We didn't want it to just do, you know, when it smiled, just like this. We wanted its head to go down, its cheeks to deform, and all this kind of stuff. So it always looks different because it looks different in every shot in the movie because it's such a gelatinous thing, which is very difficult when people try to recreate it like this. This one's not bad though. Whoever made it. Some Spirit Halloween called me a couple years back to do a Slimer mask, and I thought, that's weird. How the hell do I do a Slimer mask? How do I get those proportions on a human head? And I worked and worked and worked on it, and I finally got it to kind of work. And the guy that would wear the mask looked out of the mouth, big giant mouth. And the powers that be at Spirit kept telling me, no, that's not what Slimer looks like. And I'm like, I created Slimer. I know what Slimer. Don't tell me this. Oh my God, it didn't go well. I threw the sculpture off my balcony and quit. Well, after a couple, 3 weeks of being tortured by them, it was almost like when I did the original one. You know, I just said that there weren't too many cooks in the kitchen in the 80s, but on the design for Slimer, that was tough. I sculpted like 13 or 14 full-scale versions, miniatures, you name it, just constantly refining and changing and changing. That was a trial by fire for me, and because it was the first time I'd kind of been in charge, because I was working under Rob Bottin, under Greg Canham, under Rick Baker on all the projects until Boss Film. But when I I think the first thing I did personally on Ghostbusters was to design and sculpt Slimer, and it was really a trial by fire and seeing what it really what it's really like. And I can't say it was a lot of fun. It was fun once we got the design approved, and once we ended up on set. And that's one of the greatest things about having worked on Ghostbusters is it's a comedy, and people like me that do scary things don't quite often get an opportunity to work on a comedy. And you're on set with Bill Murray and Dan Aykroyd and blah blah blah. Come on, everybody's trying to make themselves laugh. Everybody's just having a great time, and yeah, it's very fun to work on comedies. I've been lucky enough to work on a few. I did The Rundown with The Rock. That's a good one. I made the animatronic monkeys that fuck The Rock in the face. Oh, that was crazy.
Hi friends, your humble narrator Tyler Nichols here, and I hope that you enjoyed that episode of 80s Horror Memories. If you missed our previous episode, click over here. If you want to see more from our series, click up here. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you doing? Subscribe right here. And most importantly, stay spooky, folks.